Hi and welcome to this first P&D Online video on how to price painting and decorating works. My name is Mark O'Donnell and I'm a specialist painting estimator pricing projects for painting contractors all over the UK, projects that can range from a few £1,000 to £1,000,000 plus works. This series of videos is aimed at painting contractors who are looking to improve their knowledge of pricing painting projects of all sizes, increase turnover and expand your business. I'm a UK-based estimator, but the principles of estimating you'll see in these videos apply to painting contractors all over the world. Whether you're working in pounds, dollars or euros, the principles of estimating are the same. So here we go. Now before I look at the basic methods of pricing, let's go back to the basics. And whichever method of pricing you're using, your total tender price has to include for certain elements. Now those elements are your labour, your materials, you want to make some profit out of the job, and you're going to have to cover something called overheads. Now, overheads can be of two types. They can be your company indirect overheads. These are going to include things like your office costs, your telephone and IT, your insurances, your own salary if you don't work on the tools yourself, your vehicle costs, any training costs that you have, so if you're putting operatives on things like PASMA or IPAF training courses. Your price also has to cover the project direct overheads. Now this is going to include things like fuel, travel costs, parking if there's no free on-site parking. If you're on a project where your operatives are working away, then you'll obviously have accommodation costs. And if your lads are working away, you may also give them a food allowance. So basically your tender price has to allow for your labour, materials, profit and overheads. So that's the basics. Let's go on and look at the methods of pricing that we can use. There are basically two methods. One of those methods is I'm going to call guesstimating. It's a little bit more than that because the painter is using all his experience and knowledge to estimate how many days it's going to take to complete the project and what materials he requires. The other method is to measure the works and apply what are called all-in painting rates. You may have already seen this method if you've ever priced bills of quantities. Now over the next series of videos I'm going to look at both of these methods, but because the measurement and the all-in rates takes a lot of time, I'm going to cover that over a number of videos. So we will show you about how to measure the various painting items, and we will show you all about all-in rates and how to calculate painting rates. But to finish this particular video, we're going to look at the guesstimating method. So with the guesstimating method, you as a painting contractor are going to estimate how many days you think it's going to take to complete the works. You're going to multiply the number of days by what I'm going to call the overall daily painter charge. And you're then going to add on your materials. Now you're probably thinking at this point, well, where's the mention of the overheads? Where's the mention of my profit? Well, we'll cover those items within the overall daily painter charge. So just bear with me and I'll go on to explain that shortly. First of all though, let's look at the number of days. Now as I said, with the number of days, you're using your experience, you're using all your knowledge. It is a guesstimate, and you could be looking at an existing building, or you could be looking at a new build. If you're looking at an existing building, then obviously you can go and visit the site and have wander around and look at what works are involved. If you're on a new build, you could do the same if the building's sufficiently advanced for you to look at it, but more often than not, the building isn't even up yet. So your only way of pricing this is to look at the contract drawings. So you're looking at things like plans, elevations, sections, etc. My advice to you, whichever way you're going about this, is to not look at the whole, but to go into each room within the building and estimate how many days it's going to take you to do each room, and gradually you'll build up your overall cost. So that's looking at the number of days. You've then got to decide with the project, well, how much am I going to charge per day per painter? And this basically, the overall daily painter charge is made up of three elements. You've got your prime labour cost, you're going to add on to that an allowance for overheads, and that's your company overheads and profit, which I'm going to call OHP. And then you've got to add on your project direct overheads. Now this is a daily painter charge. It's a cost per day per painter that you've got to build up here. So let's look at each of these three elements. If we look at the prime labour cost first, that's going to depend whether you're using subcontract labour or subbies, or whether you're using direct employees. Now if you're using subbies, typically in the UK at the moment, subbies are charging out at between £100 and £140 a day, and it really depends where you are in the UK. You will know how much you have to pay to get your subbies. Direct employees, that's slightly different, a little bit more difficult to calculate. Basically, you look at your hourly rate, how much do you pay your painter per hour, and let's say we're going to pay £11 per hour. Standard working day is 8 hours. So you can go multiply your 8 hours by your £11, which gives you £88. But what you also need to add on to that is an allowance for the fact that as an employer, you are paying that employee for holiday pay, sick pay, you have a national insurance contribution to make as well. We need to include for all that. So if you go and add on 25% to this amount, it will cover all of those costs. So if we're adding 25% onto the 188, we will end up with a total of £116 per day. So the prime labour cost depends how you're employing your labour. If you're using subbies, depending where you are in the country, you're going to get subbies for between £100 and £140 per day. If you're using direct employees, then you've got to do this calculation based on the hourly rate, times the number of hours worked, and add on 25% to cover for holiday pay, sick pay, national insurance, etc. Your OHP, well, your OHP is normally added on as a percentage of your prime labour cost. And what I would advise with this is if you add between 30 and 35% onto your prime labour cost value, you will have sufficient to cover your company indirect overheads and to have an allowance in there for profit. Now you may be thinking, well, do I use 30 or do I use 35? It really does depend on how competitive you want to be. If you want to keep your price really low, that you want to try and secure that project, you're very keen to secure the project, then keep it at 30%. If you're not bothered whether you win the project or you want to make sure you've got some good money in for that project, then keep it at 35%. The next thing is that you've got to allow for the project direct overheads, and these will vary from project to project. So if you remember from before, these have got to allow for things like fuel that you're putting into the vehicle. Now, the way to look at this is decide how much fuel you need to put in that vehicle to get the vehicle to the job and back. So let's say that you're going to put £20 into that vehicle, but if you've got 2 operatives in that vehicle, then per operative, the fuel allowance that you'll need to make will be £20 divided by the 2, which is £10. Let's say that there's no free on-site parking, we're going to have to pay for parking, and let's assume that we're going to have to pay £15 per day parking. Again, if I make the assumption that we've got 2 operatives in the vehicle, the £15 divided by 2 means per day per painter I need to allow £7.50. So my overall daily allowance for project direct overheads would be £10 plus £7.50, which makes £17.50. So what I'm going to do now is just go through 2 or 3 worked examples so you get the idea of this. But the overall daily painter charge is made up of the prime labour cost allowance per painter per day, an allowance in there for your company indirect overheads and profit, which is always expressed as a percentage, and an allowance for the project direct overheads, the fuel, the parking, accommodation, whatever it is. So let's do a couple of worked examples. So if we look, let's do the first example, prime labour costs first. Let's say I know that I'm having to pay my subbies £130 per day. That's how much I've got to pay. I now need to make an allowance for my company overheads and profit, and I'm going to base mine on 35% initially. So if I'm on 35%, 39% of 130 is £39 per day. I then have got to allow for the project direct overheads. Now, on this particular project, let's assume that it's relatively close to us. We're going to put £20 in the vehicle for fuel. We're going to allow for 2 operatives in that vehicle, so divided by 2, that means my fuel allowance for this particular project is going to be £10 per painter per day. I've got a little bit of parking there because there's no free on-site parking. Let's say I'm going to have to pay £10 for parking a day. Again, assuming that there are 2 operatives in the vehicle, divide the 10 by 2. So that means for parking, I need to allow £5 per painter per day. The project direct overhead allowance will be different for every single project. So you need to calculate it individually for every project that you do. This means our overall daily painter charge that we need to use for this project is £130 plus 39 plus £10 for fuel, £5 for parking, which means I need to base my price on £184 per day per painter. Okay, so there's our first example. Let's do another one quick. Let's say this time prime labour cost. I know I can get my subbies. I'm somewhere in the UK where I know I can get subbies for £120 a day. I'm again going to use a 35% OHP allowance, which means that I've got to add £42 per day per painter to cover my overheads and profit. So that's 35% of 120. Let's look at the project direct overhead cost for this one. Free on-site parking, but I've got to put fuel in the vehicle. So let's say I'm going to put £20 again in the vehicle for fuel. Let's assume 2 operatives in that vehicle, so divide that by 2. So I need a fuel allowance of £10. So my overall daily painter charge that I would need to use on this project would be 120 plus 42 plus 10, which is £172 per day. So let's do one last example. Let's do this one on a direct employee rather than using subcontract labour. Now let's assume that my hourly rate is £11 per hour for argument's sake. It's an 8-hour day. So 11 times the 8 means that I'm on £88. I've got to add the 25% on that I always have to add to cover my holiday pay, national insurance contributions, sick pay, etc., which means I'm at £116 per day. That's my prime labour cost that I need. Now for the OHP, let's do a OHP at 30% this time. So if I'm adding on for 30%, then we're going to have £33 OHP allowance. And then finally, I've got my project direct overhead. Now, again, for this, let's just assume that we've got some fuel in the vehicle. Let's say the project is really close to us, so I know I'm only going to put £10 in the vehicle a day. Assuming 2 operatives in that vehicle means I need a fuel allowance of £5. One mistake I've just spotted shows I can't add up. If you go 25% of 88, it's actually £22, so this will be 110. So my overall daily painter charge in this example will be my 110 plus my 33 plus £5, which means I need to charge £148 per day. So what you've got there is 3 worked examples on how to calculate the overall daily painter charge, whether using subcontract labour or whether you're using direct employees. So that's that part of it. Then lastly, we're left with how are we going to estimate for materials within this project. So the way that we're going to do that, there are two basic ways for your materials. You can either go and add a percentage on to your total contract value, multiplying the number of days by the overall daily painter charge, and then you add a percentage onto this value. Now typically this percentage can be somewhere between 15% as a minimum. Now that's going to be for cheaper materials, standard decorating materials. So it's going to be things like if you've got specifications that are for contract matte or gloss, all in white. If you're using cheaper manufacturers products such as Armstead, McPherson, Leyland, that type, then 15% should be sufficient. However, if you're moving up in specification, so you might be on diamond matte for argument's sake, or acrylic matte, Johnson's products, Dulux materials, Crown materials, 15% may not be enough, and you could be going up to 29%, somewhere in that region. Now, if you're using things like Farrow & Ball, Little Green Paint Company, Paint Library products, which are really expensive, then your material percentage allowance could be between 40 and 50%. So for cheaper standard contract materials, 15% should be sufficient. But if you're starting to step up and you're using higher value products, you could be going up to the 29% region. If you're using Little Green Paint Company, Farrow & Ball, that type of product, 40 to 50% allowance is what you're going to need. Your other way of doing this is actually to guesstimate the quantities that you need. You know, how many 5-litre tins of this, how many 10-litre buckets of that do you actually require? and multiplying that by your purchase cost. So you could estimate the quantity of material and multiply that by the purchase cost. So materials, either add a percentage on to your overall value of works when you've multiplied the number of days by the overall daily painter charge. Tends to be between 15-29%. If it's only cheap contract, 15%. If you're moving up into higher value products, then up to 29%. That's one side. And then your other alternative is to try and estimate your quantities of material and multiply those quantities by the purchase cost. You know, I know it's a guesstimate, but that's this system. It is guesstimating. What I just want to do then to finish off now is to run through a couple of full worked examples on this. So let's imagine we've got a project, we've looked at this project, and the first thing we need to do is to judge the number of days. So in this example, let's assume we've looked at it and we think we've got 4 weeks work for 2 painters. Now 4 weeks work for 2 painters equates to 4 times 5 days in the week times your 2 painters, which equals 40 days. Then we want to decide what overall daily painter charge we're going to use for this project. So for this one, let's assume that we're going to use, I don't know, £130 as my prime labour cost. My OHP allowance, well, let's go and add 35% onto that, which gives me £45.50. And then we're looking at the project direct overhead allowance. Now for this particular project, I'm going to assume we're again just putting £20 fuel in the vehicle. We're going to put 2 operatives in that vehicle, so my £20 divided by the 2 gives me £10. Which means that the overall daily painter charge that I need to use for this particular project is £185.50. Now at this point, that means my value of works at the minute is going to be 40 days times my £185.50, which is £7,420. I've then got to allow for materials. I'm going to use the percentage system for my materials calculation here. I'm going to say that we've looked at the specification for these works. We're okay to use Armstead, McPherson, Leyland contract emulsion for the seams and walls, standard white cheap undercoat and gloss for the woodwork. So I'm going to do this at 15%. Which means that 15% of 7,420 gives me a materials allocation of £1,113. So my tender submission for this particular project, total value of works, is going to be £8,533. And that's the amount that I would submit as my tender for this particular project. One last example then, just so you get the idea of it. Let's say we've looked at a slightly bigger project this time. Let's say this project we estimate is going to take 6 weeks for 4 painters. So the number of days is 6 times 5 days in the week times 4, which equals 120 days. Now, for this overall daily painter charge, I'm based somewhere in the UK where I know I can get my subby for £120. I'm still going to keep my OHP at 35%. Now, 35% of 120 is £42. Then I need to look at the project direct overhead allowance. And again, what I'm going to assume here is, let's say this project's a little bit further away from us, that I've got fuel in there that's £30 I've got to put in that vehicle per day. Again, I'm assuming I'm going to put 2 operatives in that vehicle. So 30 divided by 2 means that I need a £15 fuel allowance. So that gives me an overall daily painter charge of £177 per day. Now you may not want to charge out at 35%. You may decide that no, I want to make it more competitive. You could go and charge it out at 30% OHP. That really is down to you. You could, you may not have this £30 fuel allowance. Let's change that. Let's say no, it's a bit closer. I'm only going to give £20 per day, and if I divided that by 2, then rather than £15 per day, I would have a £10 per day fuel allowance, which means that I would not have 177. It would be £172. So these are important decisions that you're having to make on a project by project basis. Now, if we stick with this, then 120 days times £172 a day is 20,640. Then I've got my materials. And again, I'm going to do the materials. Well, this time, let's say we've got slightly more expensive materials. I'm going to do it at 20%. Now, 20% of 20,640 gives me 4,128, which means for this particular project, I would have an overall contract value of £24,768. And that's what I would use as my tender submission. Okay, so that is that gives you the idea of the pricing. Let's just lastly look at what are the advantages and disadvantages. Advantages and disadvantages of guesstimating. Well, it's quick. There's no question about that. It's quick. It's very good for domestic projects. If you are looking at this video and you're a domestic contractor, then it's a perfect system for you. You don't need to really go and measure the works because rooms tend to be very small. Projects tend to be, specifications tend to be very similar. It's okay for small commercial contracts. Where this method of pricing really falls down is as you start to step up in size of project. So medium to large size commercial painting contracts, it's a dangerous system to use. You could be seriously out in your estimate. You could be far too high, in which case you're not going to win the works anyway. Equally, you could be far too low, in which case, yes, you'll secure the works, but you'll be working to a loss. And the problem is, the bigger the project, the more complex the project, the more the eye is deceived. And you're generally deceived into thinking the project's smaller than it actually is. So you generally tend to underestimate. So the disadvantage to this is large projects. It's a no. You can't use it. Also, if you've got complex projects, so not standard wall heights, so your wall heights are not 2.4 as typical, they are 3, they're 4, or specifications, if you've got very expensive materials, it could be a high-spec wallpaper project, it could be unusual paint products that you're using. It's not one to use for complex projects. So the question then arises, I've got a large project to price, I've got a difficult project to price, how am I going to price it? And the only way that you can price these type of works is to measure the painting works and apply unit rates. And that's going to be the start of the next tutorial. We're going to look at measuring painting works and what are unit rates and how do we calculate them. It's going to be done over a series of videos, that one, because as you can appreciate, there's a lot for you to take in. But if you're looking to start to price medium to large size commercial painting projects, then this is the only system that you should be using. You do not use the guesstimating system. Guesstimating is fantastic, it's a great system, but please keep it to domestic works or small commercial painting projects. Thanks for watching. I hope you like the video, and we'll see you in the next tutorial. Thank you very much.